The weight of time. The oncologist's words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, dense, choking, impossible to wave away. 12 months. Maybe 14 if the experimental treatment worked. Maybe 10 if it didn't. David Marshall sat in the passenger seat of his own Honda Accord, watching his wife Sarah navigate the hospital parking garage with the kind of aggressive precision she'd perfected during their 22 years of marriage. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and she hadn't said a word since Dr. Patel had delivered the news 45 minutes ago. "Say something," David finally managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, making the concrete walls look like the inside of a tomb. "What do you want me to say?" Sarah's voice was steady, controlled, the same tone she'd used when the bank had threatened foreclosure on their house in '08, when David's father had his first stroke, when their daughter Emma had been arrested for shoplifting at 17. That everything's gonna be okay? That we'll fight this together? That's what they say in the movies, isn't it? David studied his wife's profile, noting the new lines around her eyes, the way her auburn hair had started showing gray at the temples despite the monthly visits to her colorist. When had she gotten older? When had they both gotten older? At 52, he still felt like the same guy who'd played linebacker for Ohio State, who'd carried Sarah over the threshold of their first apartment in Columbus, who'd stayed up all night assembling cribs and changing tables and dreaming about the future. "The kids," he said quietly. "We have to tell the kids." Sarah's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Ugh, that'll be a fun conversation. Hey kids, remember how Dad's been complaining about being tired all the time? Turns out it's stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Pass the mashed potatoes." "Sarah!" "No, David, don't Sarah me. Not now." She pulled into their driveway with more force than necessary, the car lurching as she hit the brakes. Their house, a modest colonial they'd bought when David's accounting practice was still growing, looked the same as it had that morning. Same blue shutters, same overgrown bushes he'd been meaning to trim, same basketball hoop mounted above the garage door where their son Jake had spent countless hours perfecting his jump shot before losing interest somewhere around sophomore year. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. They sat in silence for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. Through the kitchen window, David could see Jake moving around, probably making one of his elaborate late-night snacks. The kid was 20, home from college for winter break, still figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. Still young enough to believe his parents were invincible. "How do we do this?" Sarah asked, and for the first time since the appointment, her voice cracked. "How do we tell our children that their father is dying?" David reached across the center console and took her hand. Her wedding ring was loose now. She'd lost weight over the past year, stress-eating herself into a size smaller. Everything was getting smaller, it seemed. Everything except the weight of what they now knew. "We tell them the truth," he said. "We tell them we're going to make the most of whatever time we have." And what if that's not enough? What if 12 months isn't enough to say everything we need to say, to do everything we need to do? David squeezed her hand. "Then we better get started." Inside, the house smelled like the leftover Chinese takeout they'd picked up the night before, back when their biggest worry was whether Jake would find a summer internship and whether Emma would remember to call before her semester abroad in Ireland ended. The normalcy of it hit David like a punch to the gut. 24 hours ago, he'd been annoyed that Sarah had left the porch light on again. Now he found himself memorizing the way the light fell across the hardwood floors, the sound of the refrigerator humming, the family photos clustered on the mantelpiece above the fireplace they rarely used. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, a sandwich the size of a small child balanced in his hands. He had David's height, but Sarah's delicate features, a combination that had made him popular with girls in high school and gave him an easy confidence David had never possessed at that age. "How'd the doctor thing go?" Jake asked, around a mouthful of what appeared to be turkey, cheese, lettuce, tomato, and half a jar of mayo. "Everything okay?" David opened his mouth, then closed it. The words were there, lined up and ready, but they seemed too large for his throat. How do you tell your son that the man who taught him to drive, who'd attended every baseball game and track meet, who'd helped him move into his freshman dorm, would probably be dead before his junior year ended? "We need to talk," Sarah said, stepping into the gap. "Is Emma still awake?" "Yeah, she's on FaceTime with her boyfriend, that Irish guy with the accent she thinks is so sexy." Jake's expression shifted from casual interest to concern. "Wait, why? What's wrong?" "Go get your sister," David said. "Family meeting." Jake set his sandwich down on the kitchen counter, suddenly looking much younger than 20. "Dad, you're scaring me." "Just go get Emma, okay?" 5 minutes later, they were all gathered in the living room. The same room where they'd opened Christmas presents just 3 weeks ago, where they'd watched the ball drop on New Year's Eve, where they'd had the conversation about college costs and student loans and whether Emma's art degree was practical enough to justify the debt. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, still in her pajama pants, her laptop balanced on her knees. At 19, she had inherited David's stubborn streak and Sarah's artistic temperament, a combination that had led to some spectacular battles over the years. "Okay, you're both freaking me out," Emma said, closing her laptop. "What's going on?" David looked at Sarah, then at his children. These two people who had been the center of his universe for the past 2 decades, who had given his life meaning and purpose and more joy than he'd known was possible. How do you say goodbye when goodbye is still theoretical, still months away? "I went to see Dr. Morrison today," David began, "about the fatigue, the weight loss, all those symptoms I've been having." "And?" Jake prompted. "He sent me to an oncologist, Dr. Patel." David paused, searching for the right words. There were no right words. "I have cancer, pancreatic cancer. It's pretty advanced." The silence that followed was different from any silence David had ever experienced. It was thick and heavy and full of terrible understanding. Emma's face went pale, and Jake's sandwich seemed forgotten on the coffee table. "How advanced?" Emma asked quietly. Sarah said, when David couldn't. "It's spread to other organs." "But they can treat it, right?" Jake's voice was higher than usual. "I mean, people beat cancer all the time. There's chemo and radiation and all that stuff." David nodded. "Well, try treatment." "There are options. Clinical trials." "But—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "But what?" Emma demanded. "But the prognosis isn't good," David said finally. "Dr. Patel thinks I have about a year, maybe a little more, maybe less." Emma made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Jake just stared at his father as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "A year?" Jake repeated. "That's it? That's all?" "We don't know for sure," Sarah said quickly. "Doctors are wrong all the time. People beat the odds." "Don't," Emma said sharply. "Don't give us false hope. I can't deal with false hope right now." She was right, and David admired her for it. Emma had always been brutally honest, sometimes to a fault. She'd inherited that from him, he supposed. The need to face things head-on, even when facing them hurt. "So what happens now?" Jake asked. "Now, we live," David said. "We make the most of whatever time we have. We say the things we need to say. We do the things we want to do." "I'm dropping out of school," Emma said immediately. "No, you're not." "Yes, I am. I'm coming home. I'm not going to waste the last year of your life sitting in art classes in Ireland while you're here dying." "Emma." "No, Dad. This isn't negotiable." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I've already missed so much time. All those weekends I stayed on campus instead of coming home? All those phone calls I cut short because I had somewhere else to be? I'm not missing any more." David felt his own eyes filling. "Sweetheart, your education will still be there when you're not," she said fiercely. "I'm coming home." Jake hadn't said anything for several minutes. He sat on the couch, staring at his hands, his broad shoulders hunched forward. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "What?" Sarah moved to sit beside him. "Jake, honey, what are you talking about? All those times I gave you crap about going to the doctor. All those jokes about you getting old, about your beer gut, about how you couldn't keep up anymore. If you'd gone to the doctor sooner—" "Stop," David said firmly. "This isn't anyone's fault. Cancer isn't. It's not something you cause by not going to the doctor 6 months earlier. This was already happening. We just didn't know." But Jake was shaking his head. "I should have noticed. I should have made you go." "You're 20 years old," David said. "It's not your job to take care of me. It's my job to take care of you." "But for how much longer?" Jake's voice broke on the question. David moved to sit on his son's other side, so that Jake was sandwiched between his parents, the way he used to be when he was little and afraid of thunderstorms. "For as long as I can. And then you take care of each other." They sat like that for a long time, the four of them in the living room that had seen so many family moments, birthday parties and Christmas mornings and Sunday afternoon football games. David tried to memorize the weight of his son against his shoulder, the sound of Emma's quiet crying, the way Sarah's hand felt in his. This was what mattered. Not the accounting practice he'd built from nothing, not the 401k he'd been so careful to fund, not the college savings accounts or the life insurance policy or any of the other financial preparations he'd made for his family's future. This moment, this connection, this love that felt too big for his chest. "What do we do first?" Emma asked eventually. David considered the question. "What did you do when you found out you were dying? When you had 12 months to fit a lifetime of love and wisdom and memory-making?" "I guess we figure out what's most important," he said. Over the next few days, David tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy while grappling with the strange new reality of terminal illness. He went to his office, reviewed tax returns, met with clients, all while carrying the weight of his diagnosis like a stone in his chest. His business partner, Mark, noticed something was off almost immediately. "You look like hell," Mark said, settling into the chair across from David's desk with his usual lack of diplomacy. They'd known each other since college, had built Marshall & Associates from a shared dream and a lot of student loan debt. If anyone had earned the right to speak plainly, it was Mark. "Thanks for the pep talk," David muttered, not looking up from the stack of receipts he was organizing for the Henderson account. "I'm serious. You've been distracted all week. Sarah okay? Kids okay?" David set down his pen and really looked at his oldest friend. Mark was 53, 2 years older than David, but he looked at least a decade younger. He ran marathons, ate kale salads, hadn't touched a cigarette or a beer in 15 years. His wife posted pictures of their healthy family adventures on social media with religious frequency, hiking trips and farmers market visits and organic cooking classes. "I have cancer," David said simply. Mark's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, concern, fear, and finally a kind of determined optimism that David recognized as Mark's default response to any crisis. "Okay," Mark said slowly. "Okay, what kind? What stage? What are the doctors saying?" David explained the diagnosis, the prognosis, the treatment options Dr. Patel had outlined. As he talked, he watched his friend process the information, watched the businessman in Mark calculate timelines and probabilities and contingency plans. "So, we need to talk about the business," Mark said finally. "Mark, no, we need to. You've got 50% equity in this film, and I need to know what you want to do with it. Do you want to work as long as you can? Do you want to start transitioning clients? Do you want to sell out to me now? It was a fair question, a necessary question, but it hit David like a slap. He'd built this practice from nothing, had spent 25 years cultivating relationships with clients, building a reputation in the community. Marshall & Associates wasn't just his livelihood, it was his legacy, his proof that David Marshall had existed, had mattered, had contributed something to the world. "I want to keep working," David said, "for as long as I can." Mark nodded. "We should probably bring in another associate, someone who can learn your client base, handle the transition when—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "When I die," David completed. "You can say it, Mark. It's not a secret anymore." That evening, David found himself standing in his backyard, looking at the oak tree he'd planted the year Jake was born. It had been barely more than a sapling then, thin and fragile and requiring constant attention. Now it towers over the yard, its branches thick and strong, its roots deep enough to weather any storm. 20 years. He'd had 20 years to watch that tree grow, to see his children grow, to build a life with Sarah. Some people didn't get 20 years. Some people got 20 days or 20 minutes. When he thought about it that way, 12 more months didn't seem like such a small gift. "Dad?" David turned to find Jake standing in the doorway, backlit by the kitchen lights. "Yeah? Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Jake stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. He'd inherited David's height, but none of his bulk. At 20, Jake was all angles and nervous energy, still growing into his frame. "Are you scared?" The question hung between them in the cold January air. David's first instinct was to lie, to offer reassurance, to be the strong father had always tried to be. But something about the darkness, about the gravity of everything they were facing, demanded honesty. "Yeah," David said. "I'm terrified." Jake nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "What scares you most?" David considered the question. Dying, obviously. The process of dying, the pain that might come with it, the loss of dignity, the burden had become to his family. But underneath all of that was something deeper, more fundamental. "Leaving you guys," David said, "not being here for the things that matter. Your wedding someday, Emma's first gallery showing, grandchildren I'll never meet, missing all the good stuff that comes after. But also the bad stuff," Jake pointed out. "You'll miss the bad stuff too." David smiled despite himself. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just never listened." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, father and son, contemplating the weight of mortality in the January cold. Finally, Jake spoke again. "I've been thinking about what you said, about making the most of the time we have." "Yeah?" "I want to do something, something big, something that matters." "Like what?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet, but I want it to be something you'd be proud of, something that, I don't know, honors you somehow." David felt his throat tighten. "Jake, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Jake said firmly. "I've spent the last 2 years drifting, taking easy classes, partying too much, not really thinking about the future, because I figured I had forever to figure it out. But I don't have forever. None of us do. You have a lot more time than I do, maybe, but that doesn't mean I should waste it." The next morning brought David's first chemotherapy appointment. Dr. Patel had been honest about the limited effectiveness of treatment for pancreatic cancer at his stage, but they decided to try anyway. "We'll take any extra time we can get," Sarah had said, and David had agreed. The oncology center was nothing like the sterile, intimidating hospital rooms David had imagined. Instead, it felt almost homey. Comfortable reclining chairs around a central nurse's station, large windows overlooking a garden, soft music playing in the background. It was designed to make a terrible experience slightly less terrible, and David appreciated the effort. His nurse was a woman named Carol, probably in her early 50s, with graying blonde hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of experience, but her touch was gentle as she inserted the IV line. "First time?" she asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. "Yeah, any advice?" Carol smiled. "Don't try to be tough. If you feel sick, tell me. If you're in pain, tell me. If you're scared, tell me. My job is to take care of you, but I can't do that if you don't let me know what you need." The treatment itself was anticlimactic, just sitting in a chair for several hours while chemicals dripped into his bloodstream, reading magazines, and trying not to think about what those chemicals were doing to his body. Sarah sat beside him, working on her laptop, occasionally looking up to check on him with the hyper-vigilant attention had come to recognize as her way of coping with stress. "This isn't so bad," David said halfway through the session. Carol, who was checking his vitals, gave him a knowing look. Give it a day or two. She was right. By Thursday, David felt like he'd been hit by a truck, then backed over for good measure. Everything tasted like metal, his stomach churned at the sight of food, and he was so tired he could barely make it up the stairs to bed. But he was alive, and the drugs were buying him time. Time to have conversations he'd been putting off. Time to make arrangements he should have made years ago. Time to love his family with an intensity that felt both wonderful and heartbreaking. One afternoon in late February, as David was recovering from his second round of chemo, Emma announced that she'd withdrawn from her semester abroad and enrolled in classes at the local community college. "It's temporary," she said quickly when she saw the expression on David's face. "Just for this semester. Maybe next semester too, depending on how things go." "Emma, I've already decided, Dad, and before you say anything about throwing my life away, this isn't throwing my life away. This is choosing my family. There's a difference." David wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she return to Ireland and finish what she'd started. But the selfish part of him, the part that was desperately grateful to have his daughter home, won out. "Okay," he said, "but promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll go back. Afterward, promise me you'll finish your degree and do all those things you dreamed about." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I promise." That weekend, David decided it was time to tackle one of the most difficult items on his mental list, updating his will. He'd had a basic will for years, the kind of boilerplate document that left everything to Sarah and designated guardians for the children when they were minors. But the children were adults now, and David's situation had changed dramatically. He made an appointment with Patricia Henley, an estate planning attorney Mark had recommended. Her office was in one of those renovated Victorian houses downtown, all dark wood and Persian rugs, and the kind of understated elegance that suggested competence and discretion. "I'm sorry about your diagnosis," Patricia said after David had explained his situation. She was probably in her 60s, with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd helped many families navigate the logistics of death. "It's never easy, but I think you're wise to get your affairs in order while you still can." They spent 2 hours going through David's assets, the house, the business, the retirement accounts, the life insurance policy. It was strange, reducing a lifetime of work to a series of numbers on a spreadsheet, but also oddly comforting. At least his family would be financially secure. "Now," Patricia said, "let's talk about personal property. Family heirlooms, sentimental items, anything you want to make sure goes to specific people." David thought about his father's watch, still in the dresser drawer where he'd kept it since the funeral 5 years ago. His grandfather's World War II medals, the toolbox he'd inherited from his Uncle Mike, the one that had taught him the satisfaction of fixing things with his own hands. "My son gets the tools," David said, "and my father's watch. Emma? Emma should have her grandmother's jewelry, the good stuff, not just the everyday pieces. What about your business?" That was the complicated question. David owned 50% of Marshall & Associates, and while Mark had first right of refusal if David ever wanted to sell, the will needed to specify what happened to that stake. I want Mark to have the option to buy out my share at fair market value, David said. The money goes to Sarah and the kids, but if for some reason he can't or doesn't want to buy me out, they get the business interest. Patricia nodded, making notes. Any specific bequests? Charities, friends, other family members? David considered the question. His parents were both gone. Sarah's parents lived in Florida and were financially comfortable. He had a sister in California, but they'd never been particularly close. There's a nurse at the oncology center, David said suddenly, Carol Thompson. She's been incredibly kind, professional, but also just human, you know? I'd like to leave her something. Not a lot, but something to show my appreciation. How much were you thinking? $10,000, David said, surprising himself with the amount. But Carol saw dozens of patients like him, scared, angry, desperate people facing the end of their lives. If she could treat each of them with the same combination of competence and compassion she'd shown David, she deserved recognition for that. That's very generous, Patricia said. I'll make sure it's properly documented. As March arrived and the chemo treatments continued, David found himself settling into a strange new rhythm. 3 weeks of feeling relatively normal, followed by a week of feeling terrible, over and over again. The cancer was still there. The scans showed it wasn't growing, but it wasn't shrinking either. But the treatment was buying him time, just as Dr. Patel had hoped. It was during one of his good weeks that Carol pulled him aside after treatment. "Can I ask you a personal question?" she said. "Sure." "How are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Handling all of this with such grace. I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of patients in your situation. Some get angry, some get depressed, some just seem to give up. But you seem almost peaceful about it." David considered her question. He didn't feel peaceful most of the time. He felt scared and angry and desperately sad about everything he was going to miss. But he also felt something else, something he was still trying to name. "I think it's because I've had a good life," he said finally. "Not a perfect life, but a good one. I married a woman I love who loves me back. I raised 2 kids who turned out to be decent human beings despite my mistakes. I built a business I'm proud of. I made friends. I contributed to my community. I mattered to people." He paused. "A lot of people don't get that. A lot of people die young, or die alone, or die before they figure out what's important. I'm grateful I had time to figure it out." Carol smiled. "That's a beautiful way to look at it." "My wife says I'm in denial, that I'm not processing the reality of what's happening. Are you?" David shrugged. "Maybe a little. But what's the alternative? Spend my last year being miserable? Make everyone around me miserable? I can't control how much time I have left, but I can control how I use it." That evening, David found Jake in the garage, working on the old Mustang convertible they'd bought together the previous summer. It was a 1967 fastback that had seen better decades, but Jake had fallen in love with its classic lines and convinced David to help him restore it. They'd made slow progress over the past months, working together on weekends when Jake was home from school, learning as they went from YouTube videos and classic car forums. "How's she coming along?" David asked, running his hand along the car's primer gray fender. "Slow," Jake admitted. "I've been having trouble with the engine. Can't get her to turn over consistently." David popped the hood and peered at the engine. It was a 289 V8, not the most powerful option Ford had offered that year, but still a respectable motor when properly maintained. The problem, David could see immediately, was in the carburetor. The float was sticking, flooding the engine with too much fuel. "Here's your issue," David said, pointing out the problem. "This carburetor needs rebuilding. Want to learn how?" They spent the next 3 hours taking apart the carburetor, cleaning each component, replacing worn gaskets and seals. It was detailed, methodical work that required patience and precision, exactly the kind of project David had always loved. There was something deeply satisfying about diagnosing a problem and fixing it with your own hands. "Dad," Jake said as they were reassembling the float chamber, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot." When you were my age, did you know what you wanted to do with your life? David smiled. When I was your age, I thought I had everything figured out. I was going to be a CPA, make good money, provide for my family. The American dream, you know? But did you actually want to be an accountant? The question caught David off guard. Had he wanted to be an accountant? Or had he just chosen the safest, most practical path available to him? Honestly, I don't think I ever thought about what I wanted. I thought about what was responsible, what would pay the bills, what would make me a good husband and father. Want never really entered into it. Jake nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about the difference between what you're supposed to do and what you actually want to do. And what do you want to do? Jake was quiet for a long moment, focusing on threading a screw into place. I want to teach. High school, maybe middle school, history or social studies. I know it doesn't pay much, and I know Mom thinks I should do something more practical, but I love it. I love learning about how we got to where we are, about the choices people made and the consequences of those choices. And I think I'd be good at helping kids understand it too. David felt a surge of pride mixed with regret. Pride that his son had identified something he was passionate about. Regret that it had taken David 52 years and a terminal diagnosis to realize he'd never asked himself the same question. That sounds perfect, David said. You'd make a great teacher. Really? Really. You've got patience, you're good with people, you care about making things better. Those are the qualities that matter. Jake grinned, the first completely unguarded smile David had seen from him since the diagnosis. I was afraid you'd think it was impractical. Jake, do you know what I've learned over the past few months? What? Life's too short to spend it doing something you don't love. If teaching makes you happy, then teach. The money will work out somehow. It always does. They finished the carburetor as the sun was setting, their breath visible in the cold garage air. When Jake turned the key, the engine caught immediately, settling into a smooth, powerful idle. "We did it," Jake said, his face lighting up with accomplishment. "You did it," David corrected. "I just helped." As April arrived and David began his 4th month of treatment, he noticed changes in himself that had nothing to do with the cancer. He was more patient with difficult clients, more present in conversations with Sarah, more willing to express affection toward his children. The proximity of death, he realized, had stripped away a lot of the petty concerns that used to occupy his thoughts. He no longer worried about keeping up with the neighbors or maximizing his retirement contributions or whether the lawn looked as good as the lawn across the street. Instead, he found himself paying attention to smaller things, the way morning light fell through the kitchen window, the sound of Sarah humming while she cooked, the satisfied grunt Jake made when he solved a particularly difficult problem with the Mustang. These moments felt precious in a way they never had before, weighted with significance by their limited number. One evening in mid-April, David was sitting on the back porch, watching Emma work in the garden they'd started together when she was 12. She'd always had green thumbs, a natural understanding of what plants needed and when they needed it. Over the years, their small vegetable garden had expanded into an elaborate landscape of flowers and herbs and carefully tended beds that drew compliments from everyone who visited. "What are you planting?" David asked, as Emma carefully transplanted seedlings from their starter pots. "Tomatoes," she said without looking up. "Cherokee purples and brandywines. They'll be ready to harvest in late summer." Late summer? August, maybe September. David tried to calculate whether he'd be alive to taste those tomatoes, then stopped himself. Dr. Patel had said 12 months, maybe 14. It was April now, so August was definitely possible. September was harder to predict. "Good choices," David said instead. Emma sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. "Dad, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I'm scared I'm going to forget you." The words hit David like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Mom has pictures of her grandfather, and she tells stories about him, but she was only 5 when he died. She doesn't really remember him, not the way you remember someone you actually knew. And I'm 19. I should remember you. But what if I don't? What if in 20 years I can't remember the sound of your voice, or the way you laugh, or the way you smell like coffee and aftershave? David felt tears pricking his eyes. "Come here," he said softly. Emma moved to sit beside him on the porch steps, and David wrapped his arms around his daughter the way he had when she was small and afraid of monsters in her closet. "You're not going to forget me," he said. "You know how I know?" "How?" "Because I'm not just going to be a memory. I'm part of you. The way you care for growing things, the way you see beauty in everything, the way you're not afraid to speak your mind even when it's uncomfortable, that's not just Emma Marshall. That's the part of me that gets to keep living in you." Emma was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't try to wipe away. "Besides," David continued, "your mom's going to make sure you remember. She's been taking pictures and videos of everything for the past 3 months. I think she's documented every conversation I've had, every meal I've eaten, every time I've fallen asleep in my chair watching TV. You're going to be sick of remembering me." Emma laughed despite her tears. She has been doing that, hasn't she? "Your mother processes grief by creating archives. Let her do it. Someday you'll be grateful for all those pictures and videos, even the embarrassing ones." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the oak tree David had planted 20 years ago. Emma had been -3 when he'd planted that tree, just an idea, a hope, a possibility in the future that he and Sarah were working toward. Now she was 19, brilliant and beautiful, and more capable than she realized. "Emma?" "Yeah?" "I want you to know that being your father has been the greatest privilege of my life. You and Jake, you two are the best things I ever did. No matter what happens, no matter how scared I get or how sick I get, that's never going to change." Emma leaned against him the way she had as a child. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know." As May arrived, David's condition began to change in subtle ways. The chemo was becoming less effective, and the side effects were becoming more severe. Dr. Patel had warned this might happen. The cancer would eventually develop resistance to the treatment, and David would have to decide whether to try more aggressive therapies or focus on comfort care. "The next level of treatment is going to be much harder on you," Dr. Patel explained during David's appointment. "More side effects, more time in the hospital, more impact on your quality of life. But it might buy you a few more months." David looked at Sarah, who was clutching his hand so tightly her knuckles were white. They'd talked about this possibility, but facing it was different from imagining it. "What would you do?" David asked. "If it was your father, your husband, what would you tell them?" Dr. Patel was quiet for a long moment. "I'd tell them to think about what's most important to them. More time or better time. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they're not." That evening, David called a family meeting. Jake was home from school for the summer, having decided not to take the internship he'd been offered in Chicago. Emma had just finished her first semester at community college, earning straight A's while also helping Sarah manage David's care and the household responsibilities that had gradually shifted to accommodate his declining energy. They gathered in the living room again, the same configuration as that terrible night in January when everything had changed. But this time, David noticed, they arranged themselves differently. Instead of sitting apart, processing shock and grief individually, they clustered together. Sarah beside him on the couch, Emma curled in the chair closest to them, Jake perched on the arm of Sarah's chair so he could keep one hand on his mother's shoulder. The chemo isn't working as well as it was. Dr. Patel wants to try something more aggressive, but it would mean more time in the hospital, more side effects, and the benefits might only be measured in weeks or months. But it would be more time, Jake said immediately. That's what matters, right? David studied his son's face, seeing his own desperate hope reflected there. Maybe, or maybe it would be more time spent feeling terrible, being unable to do the things that make life worth living. So, what are you saying? Emma asked quietly. I'm saying I think it's time to stop the treatments and focus on making the most of whatever time I have left. The silence that followed was different from the shocked silence of January. This was the silence of people who had been preparing for this moment, who understood that David's decision wasn't surrender. It was a choice about how to use his remaining time. "How long?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Patel thinks maybe 3 months without treatment. Could be more, could be less." Sarah nodded, her practical mind already working through the implications. "We'll need to talk about hospice care, about making sure you're comfortable at home." "I want to be here," David said. "I want to die in our house, in our bed, with you guys around me." Emma was crying quietly, but she wasn't trying to change his mind or argue for more aggressive treatment. She understood, David realized, that this was another kind of love. Letting go when holding on would only cause more suffering. 3 months, Jake repeated. "That takes us to August." "About that, yeah." "The tomatoes will be ready," Emma said suddenly, then laughed at the absurdity of the observation. "God, I'm talking about tomatoes at a time like this." "The tomatoes matter," David said firmly. "Everything matters now. Every conversation, every meal, every stupid joke, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon. It all matters because there won't be infinite numbers of them anymore." Over the next few weeks, David found himself experiencing a strange kind of peace. Without the chemo schedule dictating his time, without the constant battle against the disease, he could focus on living rather than fighting. He was weaker than he'd been in January, tired more easily, but he was also more present, more aware of the richness of ordinary moments. He and Jake finished restoring the Mustang, working together in the garage during the long June evenings. The car wasn't perfect, there were still dents in the body they hadn't been able to afford to fix, and the interior needed complete replacement. But the engine purred like a satisfied cat, and when they took it for drives through the countryside, David felt like he was 25 again. "I want you to keep this," David told Jake as they were washing the car one Saturday morning. "After I'm gone, I want you to drive it and think about all the Saturday mornings we spent figuring out how to make it run." Jake nodded, unable to speak around the emotion in his throat. "And I want you to teach your kids how to work on cars," David continued. "Not because they'll need to know how. Hell, everything's going to be electric by the time you have kids. But because there's something important about understanding how things work, about being able to fix something with your own hands." "I will," Jake managed, "I promise." Emma had thrown herself into documenting everything, taking over the project Sarah had started months earlier. She filmed David telling stories about his childhood, about how he'd met Sarah, about the early days of their marriage when they'd been young and broke and convinced they could conquer the world together. She recorded him reading from the books he'd loved, sharing his thoughts on everything from baseball to politics to the proper way to grill a steak. "This is for your kids," she told David one afternoon as she adjusted the camera angle. "And their kids. I want them to know their grandfather, even if they never get to meet him." David found the camera presence awkward at first, but gradually he began to appreciate the conversations it prompted. Emma asked thoughtful questions about his life, his regrets, his hopes for the family's future. She was creating more than a documentary. She was helping him examine his own story, to make meaning from the collection of experiences and choices that had brought him to this point. One evening in late June, Carol from the oncology center called to check on him. David was touched that she'd followed up, especially since he was no longer her patient. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Different," David said honestly. "Weaker physically, but I don't know how to explain it. Calmer, maybe? Like I've stopped fighting against something I was never going to win anyway." That makes sense. A lot of my patients go through something similar when they transition from active treatment to palliative care. There's a kind of relief in accepting what's happening instead of constantly battling against it. "Carol, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "In all your years doing this job, what have you learned about dying well?" Carol was quiet for a long moment. "I've learned that dying well isn't about being brave or stoic or positive all the time. It's about being honest, with yourself and with the people you love. It's about saying the things that need to be said, forgiving what needs to be forgiven, and letting people take care of you when you need to be taken care of. I've never been good at that last part." Most men aren't. But David, letting your family help you through this, that's a gift to them, not a burden. It's how they show their love when there's nothing else they can do. After he hung up, David thought about Carol's words. He'd spent his entire adult life being the provider, the protector, the one who solved problems and fixed things that were broken. Learning to be the one who needed care was perhaps the hardest part of this entire experience. But gradually, he found himself accepting help more gracefully. When Sarah wanted to drive him to appointments, he let her. When Emma insisted on cooking his favorite meals, he thanked her instead of protesting that she was doing too much. When Jake offered to handle the yard work David could no longer manage, he handed over the keys to the riding mower with something approaching gratitude. July brought the kind of heat that made the Midwest feel like a sauna, the air thick and still and heavy with the promise of thunderstorms that never quite materialized. David found himself spending more time indoors, his energy sapped by the combination of heat and disease. But even confined to the house, he discovered new appreciation for the life his family had built together. He spent hours looking through photo albums with Sarah, remembering their courtship, their early years of marriage, the chaos and joy of raising small children. They laughed over pictures of themselves from the 80s, Sarah's enormous hair, David's mustache, both of them looking impossibly young and optimistic. "We did pretty well, didn't we?" Sarah said one afternoon, closing an album from Emma's elementary school years. "We did great," David agreed. "Better than great." Sarah leaned against him on the couch, her head on his shoulder. "I'm going to miss this. Just talking with you. You're my best friend, you know that?" "I know, you're mine too." "What am I going to do without you?" It was a question they'd been dancing around for months, both afraid to voice it directly. David had thought about it constantly, how Sarah would manage the finances, the house, the 1,000 daily decisions that couples shared. But more than the practical considerations, he worried about her emotional landscape after he was gone. "You're going to be sad for a while," David said. "Really sad. Sadder than you've ever been. And that's okay. You should be sad. I'd be insulted if you weren't." Sarah laughed despite the tears that had started flowing. "But then, gradually, you're going to start remembering the good stuff more than the sad stuff. You're going to have dinner with friends and laugh at something silly, and you're going to feel guilty for laughing, but you shouldn't. You're going to meet someone at the grocery store or the library or wherever, and he's going to be interested and kind, and you're going to feel guilty for being interested, but you shouldn't. David, I'm serious, Sarah. I want you to fall in love again someday. Not right away, but someday. You're 50 years old, and if you're lucky, you've got 30 or 40 years left. That's too long to spend alone." Sarah was crying harder now. "I don't want to fall in love with anyone else. I want to fall in love with you again, every day, for the next 40 years. "I know, baby, I know. But that's not the hand we got dealt." They held each other on the couch as the afternoon faded into evening, grieving not just for the future David wouldn't see, but for the future they'd planned together, The retirement they'd never share, the grandchildren he'd never spoil, the quiet contentment of growing old together. As July moved into August, David's decline became more noticeable. He slept more during the day, ate less, moved more slowly through the house that had been his domain for over 2 decades. The hospice nurse, a gentle woman named Margaret, came by twice a week to check on his medications and his comfort level. She taught Sarah and the kids what to watch for, how to help him manage pain, how to recognize when the end was approaching. It could be days, it could be weeks, Margaret told them during one of her visits, but probably not months. David found he was grateful for the honesty. He'd lived his life planning ahead, thinking about the future, and even dying, he wanted to know what to expect. One evening in mid-August, as David was dozing in his recliner after dinner, he heard Emma and Jake talking quietly in the kitchen. "I keep thinking I should be doing more," Emma was saying. "Like there should be some perfect thing to say or do that would make this easier for him." "I know what you mean," Jake replied. "I keep wanting to ask him for advice about everything I might need to know for the rest of my life, like I can stockpile wisdom or something." "Have you asked him?" "Some things, but it feels weird, like I'm already treating him like he's gone." David smiled to himself. His children were so much wiser than he'd been at their ages, so much more emotionally aware. They'd inherited the best parts of both their parents: Sarah's empathy and emotional intelligence, his determination and work ethic, while somehow avoiding most of their flaws. "Hey guys," David called softly. They appeared in the living room doorway, looking slightly guilty for having been caught talking about him. "Come sit with me for a minute." They arranged themselves on either side of his chair, and David was struck by how much they'd both grown over the past 8 months. Jake had put on weight, filled out his frame, started carrying himself with more confidence. Emma had cut her hair shorter, developed a more sophisticated style that made her look older, more mature. "I heard what you were saying in there," David said, "and I want you to know something. You don't have to do anything special to make this easier for me. You don't have to say the perfect words or create the perfect moments. You just have to be yourselves, the way you've always been." "But what if we forget to tell you something important?" Emma asked. "Like what?" Like how proud we are of you, how grateful we are that you're our dad, how sorry we are for all the times we were difficult or ungrateful or took you for granted." David felt his eyes filling. "Emma, sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. Being your father has been the greatest joy of my life. Both of you, you've given my life meaning and purpose I never could have found anywhere else." "We wanted to do something," Jake said, "something special, to honor you." "Like what?" Jake and Emma exchanged glances. "We've been working on a project," Emma said. "Remember how you always talked about wanting to travel, about all the places you wanted to see but never had time to visit?" David nodded. He and Sarah had always planned to travel after retirement. Europe, maybe Australia, certainly more of the United States than they'd managed to see during their child-rearing years. "We can't take you to those places," Jake continued, "but we brought them to you." Emma disappeared for a moment and returned with her laptop. "We've been working on this for weeks," she said, opening a video file. "Every place you ever mentioned wanting to visit, we found footage of it. Virtual tours, travel documentaries, local people talking about their cities. It's not the same as being there, but—" The video began with images of the Scottish Highlands, the rolling green hills David had always wanted to explore because of his family's heritage. Then Ireland, where Emma had spent her semester abroad. Italy, Greece, Australia, New Zealand, a visual journey through all the places that had captured David's imagination over the years. But more than just tourism footage, Jake and Emma had found personal stories. Farmers in Tuscany talking about their vineyards, fishermen in Scotland describing their daily routines, ordinary people in extraordinary places sharing what they loved about their homes. "This is incredible," David said, watching a segment about the Australian outback.
"How long did this take you?" "About 60 hours," Emma said, "but it was worth every minute. We learned so much about these places, and it felt like we were taking the trip with you." David realized that his children had given him something more valuable than any actual journey could have provided. They'd given him their time, their creativity, their love expressed through countless hours of careful research and editing. The video wasn't just about the places he'd wanted to see. It was about being known and loved well enough that his children understood his dreams and wanted to help fulfill them in whatever way they could. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't articulate. His gratitude not just for the video, but for having raised children who could conceive and execute such a loving gesture. They spent the rest of the evening watching the virtual journey together, pausing frequently for David to share what had attracted him to each destination, for Emma and Jake to describe what they'd learned while researching, for all of them to imagine what it would have been like to explore these places as a family. The next morning, David woke up feeling different, not necessarily worse, but changed in some fundamental way, as if his body had shifted into a new phase of the process. He called for Sarah, and when she appeared in the bedroom doorway, he could see in her face that she noticed the change too. "Should I call Margaret?" she asked. David considered the question. He felt weak, more so than usual, but not in distress. Not yet. But maybe today would be a good day for us all to be together. Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. "I'll call the kids." Within an hour, Jake and Emma were both home, moving through the house with the kind of quiet efficiency that people develop in the presence of serious illness. No one spoke directly about what they all sensed, that David's time was running short, but their actions revealed their awareness. Emma made David's favorite breakfast, even though he could only manage a few bites. Jake brought him the newspaper and read him the sports section, keeping up a running commentary about the Cubs' disappointing season. Sarah simply stayed close, her hand finding his whenever they were in the same room. As the day progressed, David found himself drifting in and out of consciousness, but even in his light sleep, he was aware of his family's presence around him. They took shifts sitting beside his chair, talking quietly, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes just maintaining the kind of comfortable silence that long-married couples and close families learn to appreciate. In the late afternoon, Carol called to check on him. When Sarah explained what was happening, Carol asked to speak to David directly. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Peaceful," David said, and realized he meant it. "Ready, I think." "That's normal. Your body knows what it's doing, even when your mind wants to fight it." "Carol, I want to thank you for everything. You made the hardest thing I've ever gone through bearable." "That's my job, David." "But it was my pleasure. You and your family, you're good people. It's been an honor taking care of you." After he hung up, David asked Sarah to help him get settled in bed. Moving from the chair to the bedroom required significant effort now, but he wanted to be in the place where he'd spent so many peaceful nights, where he and Sarah had made love and raised their children and built their life together. The whole family gathered in the bedroom as evening fell. Jake sat in the chair by the window, Emma curled up at the foot of the bed, Sarah lying beside David with her head on his shoulder. It felt natural, intimate, like countless other evenings they'd spent together over the years, except for the weight of impending goodbye that hung over everything. "Tell me something good," David said softly. "Tell me about the future." Jake spoke first. "I'm going to finish my degree in education. I'm going to teach high school history, and I'm going to tell my students about the importance of family, about how the choices we make echo through generations." Emma took his hand. "I'm going to go back to Ireland and finish my art degree. I'm going to create beautiful things that make people feel the way you've always made me feel, loved and supported and capable of anything." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "I'm going to live the life you'd want me to live. I'm going to be sad for a while, but then I'm going to find ways to be happy again. I'm going to watch our children become the amazing adults I know they'll be, and I'm going to tell their children stories about their grandfather who loved them before they were even born." David smiled, feeling a profound sense of completion. This was what mattered, not the business he'd built or the money he'd saved, but the love he'd nurtured and the legacy he was leaving in the hearts and minds of the people who mattered most. "I love you all so much," he whispered, "more than I ever found words to tell you." "We know, Dad," Emma said. "We've always known." As the night deepened, David's breathing became more labored, but his family's presence kept him anchored to the world. They took turns telling him their favorite memories: family vacations, birthday celebrations, quiet Sunday mornings, the thousand small moments that had woven their lives together. Sarah talked about their wedding day, about dancing to "At Last" in the church basement while their friends and family celebrated around them. Jake described learning to drive in the parking lot of the community college, how patient David had been when he'd accidentally put the car in reverse instead of drive and nearly hit a light pole. Emma shared the memory of planting their first garden together, how David had let her be in charge, even though she was only 12 and didn't really know what she was doing. Sometime after midnight, David's breathing became shallower, more irregular. Margaret had prepared them for this, had explained what the final stages would look like, but knowing what to expect didn't make it easier to experience. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, her lips close to his ear. "It's okay to let go. We'll be okay. We'll take care of each other." David wanted to respond, to offer one final reassurance, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he squeezed Sarah's hand as tightly as his failing strength would allow, hoping she understood that the gesture meant everything he couldn't say. He died just as the sun was rising, slipping away so quietly that for a moment none of them were sure he was gone. It was Jake who finally said what they all knew: "He's at peace now." They sat with him for a long time as the morning light filled the bedroom, each of them taking the time they needed to say their private goodbyes. When the funeral home finally came to take David's body, the family stood together on the front porch, watching as the hearse disappeared down the tree-lined street where David had jogged countless mornings, where he'd taught his children to ride bicycles, where he'd lived a life that was ordinary in all the best ways. 3 weeks after the funeral, Patricia Henley called to discuss the reading of David's will. The family gathered in her office on a humid September morning, all of them still moving through the world with the careful deliberation of people navigating fresh grief. The will contained no surprises. The house and the majority of David's assets went to Sarah, with provisions for Jake and Emma's educations and their futures. The business partnership with Mark had been dissolved according to their previous agreement, providing financial security for the family. David's personal effects were distributed as he'd specified: his father's watch to Jake, his grandmother's jewelry to Emma, various keepsakes to extended family and close friends. But at the end of the reading, Patricia smiled and pulled out a separate envelope. "There's one more bequest," she said. "David was very specific that this be handled privately, outside the formal will." She handed Sarah a cashier's check made out to Carol Thompson in the amount of $10,000, along with a letter in David's handwriting. "He asked that you deliver this personally," Patricia explained. The next day, Sarah drove to the oncology center with Emma beside her. They found Carol at the nurse's station, reviewing charts with the same calm efficiency David had always admired. "Mrs. Marshall," Carol said, her face immediately softening with sympathy, "how are you holding up?" "Some days are better than others," Sarah replied honestly. "But we wanted to give you something from David." She handed Carol the envelope, watching as the nurse's expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something approaching shock as she read the letter and saw the check. "I don't understand," Carol said. This is incredibly generous, but I was just doing my job." "You were doing much more than that," Emma said. "You made Dad feel like a person, not just a patient. You treated our whole family with such kindness during the worst time of our lives." Carol's eyes filled with tears. "Your husband, your father, he was special. He faced everything with such dignity, such grace. In 12 years of doing this work, I've never had a patient handle terminal illness the way he did. He would want you to know how much your care meant to him, Sarah said, to all of us. After they left the oncology center, Sarah and Emma drove to the cemetery where David was buried. His headstone was simple, elegant. David James Marshall, beloved husband, father, and friend. Below that, the dates of his birth and death, and a single line, "He lived well and loved deeply." They sat on the small bench Sarah had had installed, looking out over the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. It was a beautiful spot, peaceful and quiet, with old oak trees providing shade and a small pond reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. "Mom," Emma said after a long silence, "are you going to be okay?" Sarah considered the question. Was she going to be okay? She missed David with an intensity that sometimes made it hard to breathe. She missed his presence in their bed, his voice calling goodbye as he left for work, his opinions on everything from politics to what they should have for dinner.
She missed being part of a couple, being half of a partnership that had defined her adult life. But she was also discovering strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was learning to make decisions on her own, to find pleasure in small solitary moments, to appreciate her relationships with Jake and Emma in new ways now that they were bound together by shared loss and shared love for David's memory. "I think I'm going to be okay," Sarah said finally. "It's going to take time, and there are going to be hard days. But Dad taught me something important during those last months." "What?" "He taught me that the best way to honor someone you love is to keep living, not just surviving, but really living, finding joy, making connections, contributing to the world. He would want that for all of us." Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder. "I miss him so much." "I know, sweetheart. I miss him too. But look what he gave us. He gave us each other, and he gave us the knowledge that we're capable of loving someone so completely that losing them breaks our hearts. That's not a small thing. That's actually a wonderful thing." As they sat in the quiet cemetery, Sarah found herself thinking about the future in a way she hadn't since David's diagnosis. Jake would graduate in the spring and begin his teaching career, carrying forward David's values of service and integrity. Emma would return to Ireland, armed with a deeper appreciation for family and a clearer understanding of what mattered most in life. And Sarah herself would navigate the next phase of her life with the confidence that comes from having loved well and been loved well in return. David had given them a year to prepare for his death, and in doing so, he'd given them a lifetime of understanding about what it meant to live with intention and purpose. His legacy wasn't just in the financial security he'd provided or the business he'd built. It was in the way he'd faced his mortality with grace, the way he'd prioritized relationships over achievements, the way he'd demonstrated that even in dying, there were choices to be made about how to love your family well. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since that terrible day in Dr. Patel's office. David was gone, but the best parts of him lived on in the people he'd loved, in the lessons he'd taught, in the example he'd set of how to be a good man, a devoted husband, a loving father. She would miss him for the rest of her life, but she would also carry him with her for the rest of her life, and that made all the difference. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, Sarah received a call from Carol at the oncology center. "I wanted to let you know," Carol said. "I used David's gift to go back to school. I'm getting my master's degree in palliative care. I want to become better at what I do, to help more families the way I was able to help yours." Sarah smiled, imagining David's approval of Carol's decision. He would have loved that. "I think about him often," Carol continued, "about all of you. He showed me something important about how to face the end of life with dignity. I want to help other patients find that same peace." After they hung up,
Sarah walked out to the garden where David's tomatoes were beginning to sprout. Emma had planted them again this year, just as she had promised, and they were growing strong and healthy in the rich soil. By August, they would be ripe and ready for harvest, and Sarah would taste them and remember the man who had taught her that even in the face of death, there was still beauty to be cultivated, still love to be shared, still hope to be nurtured. The weight of time, Sarah realized, wasn't just about how much time you had. It was about how you chose to use whatever time was given to you. David had understood that in a way that transformed not just his own final year, but the lives of everyone who loved him. And that, she knew, was a legacy worth living up to.